you wake up in the world of broken hope? Are you there already begging for the rope? Are you trying to sit back and toe the line? Or do you think that you can barely find the time? Some of us prepare.
Welcome to Bold Conversations About Race, a podcast brought to you by SURJ National in collaboration with Small Beans Comedy and produced by White People for Black Lives. I'm one of your hosts, Dahlia Ferlito. I use they, them pronouns.
And I'm Ivette Ale. I use they, them pronouns as well.
For today's episode, we have Erin Heaney. She is the National Director of Showing Up for Racial Justice, also known as SURJ, a national organization that organizes in majority white communities to undermine the power of the right and bring more white people into multiracial, anti-racist movements for justice. She brings over a decade of experience running grassroots campaigns for economic, racial, and environmental justice and building organizations to enable transformative organizing. In her time at SURJ, Erin has shepherded significant growth and strategic shifts, including the growth of the SURJ chapter network to over 175 local groups working on issues of policing, mass incarceration, and immigration, and the launch of SURJ's electoral organizing programs and the robust centering of and expansion of SURJ's organizing in poor and working class, rural, and southern communities. And I will say, as a member of the Showing Up for Racial Justice National Leadership Team, Erin is a friend, a homie, a comrade, and I'm so thrilled that we're going to be interviewing her today and talking about SURJ's work in the history of white people organizing in racial justice movements.
So, Erin, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from, and how did you arrive to organizing white people?
Well, I am from Buffalo, New York, which is where I still live, and that's where most of my people still are. I grew up here in a big Irish-Italian family, and I, there was definitely some movement lineage in my family. My dad was a union negotiator. And he was also an investigative reporter, which means that I grew up in a house with a pretty healthy dose of skepticism of like anybody in power. Didn't matter what political party you were or if you're an elected official or didn't matter who you were. My dad was suspicious of you.
Question everything.
And he got it from his dad, who was an attorney and deeply connected to the struggles in Northern Ireland. He represented a lot of the hunger strikers who were incarcerated by the British Empire in Northern Ireland, and he sued the British Empire like under the Special Powers Act, which was like this bill that was incarcerating all kinds of Catholics in Northern Ireland. So they say, I never met my grandpa, but they say I'm a lot like him. I'm the carry through, I suppose. And, in my family growing up, we had all kinds of people in my family, people of all political stripes. We had Democrats, Republicans, and, we were definitely a cross-class crew. We didn't talk about race a whole lot when I, growing up at all, even though there was a lot of politics in my family. And I think one of the really important threads that led me, kind of started me on the journey to organizing white folks was I organized in Buffalo and the surrounding towns when I came home from college. I worked with an environmental justice organization that was organizing in communities that were really, really polluted because of racism and classism. And we just saw in the work over and over and over again that, we weren't going to be able to build enough power or build a multiracial coalition without doing the work with white folks. I remember a time, there's lots of stories to tell about this, but I remember a time we had been kind of winning neighborhood by neighborhood. Some neighborhoods were mostly white. Some neighborhoods were mostly black. And we brought folks together. We were like, we're going to have this amazing training. We're going to take on the governor. And like within the first 20 minutes, like a bunch of white people said a lot of racist stuff. And the whole thing completely blew up, rightfully so. And that's just one example of, without addressing racism, we can't actually get to the work of organizing and building solidarity. If we don't address racism. So I think I just became convinced that actually on a really pragmatic level, we weren't going to be able to build enough power and have enough strength to really change systems without addressing racism, especially with the white folks, the people that I came from. And I remember also just getting a lot of feedback. I was lucky that I got a lot of feedback from movement elders, but also from folks of color in my life who were invested in my leadership and who were, would call me out, when I was, when I needed to be checked or when I needed feedback about how I was showing up in space. And, I remember, one of the most vivid memories I have is a dear comrade, once really at the beginning of my journey around white supremacy and racism was just sat me down and was like, you know what, Erin, your way is not the only way of doing things. And, it felt like shit in the moment. I was like mortified and embarrassed. And it was like a really important and gift in retrospect. And it sent me down a path of doing a lot more study, a lot more learning, a lot more being in relationship with people who were doing the deep kind of learning and unlearning around white supremacy and racism that I really needed to do if I was going to be able to show up in movement and contribute in a powerful way. So I got to do lots of learning about like how my family became white, like what we had to give up because of that. I did a lot of learning on like the history of white supremacy and just more the history of this country that I was never taught as a white person. So it was really those two threads that I was like really lucky to dig in like really, really deeply. And I think I have deep respect for both traditions. And I think that either one alone really is insufficient, right? Like I think at SURJ, one of the things we're trying to do is blend the best of like analysis and deep political education with actually organizing out in the world to change systems and structures. So I think deep respect for both lineages there that we're trying to blend, I think. Yeah, those are some of the threads. And then when I was really, really deeply moved by the uprisings in Ferguson, like young, mostly Black folks taken to the streets and wanted to show up in that moment, alongside them. And so I started like a bail fund in Buffalo, and we were sending money to keep people in the streets every night. And we founded our SURJ chapter here in Buffalo. I was part of getting that crew off the ground. Yeah, so I think those are some of the threads that led me to this work around organizing white folks.
We have, of course, a few other questions that we wanted to get to, but, you were sharing several things that for myself, I obviously deeply resonate with because I think we had similar paths in terms of receiving the gift of feedback that led us to building an anti-racist analysis and then a desire to take anti-racist action. And so I wanted to like pause for one moment on like viewing feedback as a gift, right? Like, because I think that sometimes or oftentimes for white folks, when we get feedback that like we might be behaving in ways that are causing pain or harm or just, being received poorly by people that we are in relationship to, that an instinct becomes defense. We want to explain, we want to try to justify or rationalize, and we see this as like something that we need to almost repel in many ways. Like, oh, what are you trying to say? I'm not a good person. Like all of these other these rationales where we push against receiving feedback, and then to just like reframe to say like actually somebody is like going out of their way and causing themselves great discomfort in many levels by giving us feedback about how we are behaving in ways that are not congruent with how we see ourselves or think of ourselves. And so therefore it's giving us the opportunity to course correct. And so for white folks who might be listening, like, I just want to stress the importance of like thinking about feedback as a gift, and it gives us an opportunity to do something different, to be something different, and to show up in different ways. And the other piece that wanted to talk a little bit more about is if you can kind of elaborate on what your family had to give up to be white. Like, what does that mean? Like, I know that, we in some spaces, so in like for us in the Unmasking Whiteness Institute that we have here in Los Angeles, we have a series of ways in which we try to allow folks to understand the process of assimilation. So, when European immigrants come to this country as very specific ethnicities, and whether it's, Italian, Polish, Irish, what have you, and what that process was like to then become white, right? Like, so do you have anything you wanted to share with our audience around that?
For sure. I mean, I think, just on a very practical level, like we had to give up our name. We gave up our names. Like my Italian family, there was a story that my grandpa assimilated and he gave up the name So he changed his name to Mardino. So it's really interesting. So the Italian side of my family very intentionally assimilated, and then the Irish side of my family, like in my parents' home, there's like a framed thing that says your name is Irish, your name is Heaney, your name is Irish. Don't you ever forget it. Basically, it's much more eloquent than that. But so we had to give up our name. We gave up all kinds of culture. There's all kinds of things that I never learned that I've been trying to rediscover. But all kinds of, and I think the one that feels really, among those, I think are resiliency practices that kept people alive for generations and kept people much more deeply connected to the earth that I never had access to. And I know that, my own quality of life is not what it could have been, because we had to give that up in order to assimilate. So I've been thinking a lot lately about, culture and resiliency practices. So there's a lot of other things too.
The element of cultural loss, and then what we need to do to try to fill that cup once it's not there anymore. So we're going to pivot a little bit to talking more about history. And, we know you're not like a historian, right? But like as people who organize white people, we think it's important to know who our ancestors were, who our elders were, like who are the people that have been thrown down far beyond our time, because I think that like a lot of our history completely erases the fact that there has ever been a resistance, like that there was ever white people resisting a white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal, heterosexist, all the things that like we were just like never there, and that we don't have a legacy for us to build on. And then within that story, we know that showing up for racial justice is part of that legacy, is that story too. So if you'd like to sort of fold in a little bit about that history too.
Yeah. This is intimidating because Dahlia and I have many historian friends, and I'm not one of them, but I'm going to do my part to tell our history. Yeah, I mean, to your point, Dahlia, like there have always been, and Carla Wallace, who's one of the founders of SURJ, always says, we have always been there, always imperfectly, and always too few of us. But
Carla's saying that.
But
we'll have her on.
But there is a long lineage that we come from for those of us who are white and who are doing this work. I think about, all the way back to like Reconstruction, right? There were poor white folks that were, lining up and fighting back against plantation owners, who were, like that, goes back that far. I think about the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921, right? Which was a pretty epic battle between coal miners who were up against the coal company and deputized, did I say that right? Deputized, coal company mining forces who like mowed them down. And the white workers, wore, this is actually where the this is where the term redneck comes from, because the white workers wore red bandanas to signify that they were in solidarity with the other black workers and not the white mine owners or the deputies who were, authorized to mow people down. So that's pretty powerful. It's like pretty epic battle, labor history battle. There were lots of white folks who participated in the white Southern freedom movement, right? The civil rights movement. There were people like Anne and Carl Braden, who were a couple in Louisville, Kentucky, and who organized throughout the South, alongside people like Ella Baker, and they knew Dr. King and so many other people who made the Southern movement freedom come to life and be animated. And, Anne was very, very clear about the need to organize white people. She did a lot of work, agitating and organizing white women about the particular ways that white women were being used to prop up, the status quo. Their family bought a house for a black family before integration. Integrated neighborhoods were legal, and Carl went to prison because of that. Their house was bombed. So they were pretty powerful ancestors that we have to look back on, I think. And we have some direct lineages at SURJ to Anne. I think about people like Mickey Schwerner, who was murdered by the Klan, who was a Southern freedom rider, who came down to register voters in the Deep South, and was murdered alongside other comrades. These are white folks who took real risk, right? At SURJ, we talk a lot about like being accountable through action. And these are people who really put their bodies on the lines like over and over and over again. And then I think, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which had doing a lot of organizing across the South in, as the Black Power movement was growing alongside the Southern Freedom Movement and the Civil Rights Movement, there was a call from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was multiracial, but from Black leadership within SNCC, which is the shorthand for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, for white folks who had been involved in that struggle to go home, essentially, and to organize their own. There was pretty deep respect for the risks that people had taken, but there was also an acknowledgement that the biggest barriers to winning the things that people were struggling for were white communities. And so white folks were asked to go home and organize their own people in the places they're from to get more folks to line up alongside the Southern Freedom Movement. And that happened in pockets for sure. The Poor People's Campaign did a lot of this work out of the Highlander Center, organizing in much more conservative white communities where people were really, really struggling, organizing people into a poor people's movement and helping people understand that their fates were really tied to other, poor and working class communities of color. So that happened. And the Highlander Center, which is a training center in Tennessee, really helped facilitate a lot of that work, which was a place where a lot of multiracial organizing was happening. And then there was another formation that came. Is this too much information? Is this okay? I feel like I'm going down memory lane.
Oh no, keep going.
Okay. So then there was another formation that also grew out of some of these other characters that we've named was, the Southern Student Organizing Committee, SSOC, which was founded by a couple of the white folks who were part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, very intentionally to organize white students into this movement. They were going to mostly white college campuses. And it was, Stokely Carmichael was very into this idea, and actually SNCC gave these white students their first $300 to start the organizing effort. That's something that Pam McMichael, who is a former director at the Highlander Center, has kind of carried that history forward. So they tried it, wasn't super successful, but they learned a lot, there's a lot there. And then I think the only other historical example I'd want to lift up is the Rainbow Coalition in Chicago that Fred Hampton grounded. And it was a multiracial working class coalition. And the Young Patriots were the kind of white crew of people that were organizing poor white folks against police brutality, for, housing and a whole range of other kind of around a people's platform. But people were doing it very intentionally kind of around their identities as well. So yeah, so we come from those are just some examples. Our history friends, Dahlia, can come back and give more examples. But just to say, I didn't know all this history before I found SURJ, to be honest. I knew some of it, but really not most of it. And it's been a really powerful piece to know, wow, we actually do have all this lineage at our back. And some folks we can be proud of. There's a lot to not be proud of. And when you're just a white person looking back in history.
But I think the important thing there's a couple things that I think about that. I think one thing was Ibram X. Kendi mentioned was just this notion that a lot of people talk about racism, the historical racism that we think about, those were just the signs of the times. Those were the times everybody was racist, everybody, and it's no, that actually was not ever the case. There was never a time in which everybody just went along with it. There was always a resistance, and that resistance came from so many places, including white folks.
Yeah, I mean, hearing the history is super powerful, especially to our white listeners that are engaging in anti-racist work for the first time. Coming out of the uprisings, there was a lot of folks that were being exposed to anti-racist work for the first time with the uprisings. And so, note to white folks, you're not the first and you're not alone, right? Mm-hmm. There's deep legacy of resistance that you can be proud of. And that's not something that most folks hear in engaging with anti-racist work, right? So I think that piece is particularly powerful.
Should I speak a little bit about SURJ?
Yeah.
Yeah. So then SURJ came along, not out of nowhere, in fact, deeply connected to this lineage. We were founded as an organization by folks who were already really deep in movement and doing anti-racist work in other ways. And there was, really intense backlash, as I hope most folks know, to the election of the first Black president, Barack Obama. And so we were founded in a moment where we were seeing escalations in hate crimes. And we were also seeing the really not new, but escalated and intentional ways in which the right was using race to peel white people off, and, poor working class white folks in particular, from joining the struggle for winning healthcare reform in this country. So I don't know, folks may remember like the really heated, after the last, 7, 8 years, this may feel quite faint.
Death panels? Are we going to talk about the death
panels? You remember the death panels and the very intense ways where largely white folks were being mobilized to show up at these town halls. There were really racialized attacks against the president, and these really intense narratives like who was deserving of healthcare, right? That were very, very racialized. And it was being used by, at the time, the Tea Party, to make sure that, that the growing movement was weakened. And there were a lot of movement leaders of color in that moment that were saying, like, white folks, what are you doing? Like, the right is coming for your people, and they're being quite successful. And so what are y'all going to do in response? And so it was really in response to, informal conversations people were having, and also, a call that SURJ was formed, and white folks began to come together to talk about what we were going to do as white people in this moment. And we were convened by Pam McMichael, who was at the time the director at the Highlander Center, and very clearly carried this, deep lineage with her, and was, kind of following back on that as well. So, so that's how we were founded. And for a really long time, we were pretty low to the ground. But we've grown really substantially, I think, in response to the really deep and strategic organizing of the movement for Black Lives and so many other frontline organizations that have really agitated more white people to get off the sidelines, pick a side, and get into action. So, yeah.
So thank you for giving us that background on SURJ. I'm curious to hear more about SURJ's values. Like, you all show up so well. We've had the pleasure of organizing with White People for Black Lives, which is the SURJ chapter here in LA. And by we, I mean JusticeLA, and so many different organizations that are led by directly impacted folks, Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer, trans folks. And so I'm curious, what are the values that drive the way that you all show up?
Yeah, so we've got a bunch of values at SURJ. Someone made a song about them once.
Oh, maybe we can get it.
Oh, Dahlia, you don't know that? I was going to make you try to sing with me, maybe. So I think we've tried over the years articulated a handful of values that really ground our work. And it feels important to say that, like, comes out of the work. It's not like some abstract conversation we had. It's really been from like a practice of being in the work, reflecting, and then trying to articulate like what we were learning. There's so many of them. So let me see if I can remember all of them. Dahlia might have to have you in. I mean, I think the first I already mentioned, I think earlier in our conversation, which is accountability through action. And, we know that racism and white supremacy express at all kinds of levels, right? It expresses at the individual level, at the cultural level, at the systemic level. And a lot of anti-racist efforts stay really, really focused at just the individual level and just behavior change level, right? And we can get really stuck in the like wanting to know everything before we move into action. And I want to be really clear, this doesn't mean we're like off by ourselves. Or like if we by ourselves think we have a great idea, we like spring into action, right? We want to be in relationship with folks on the front lines, right? And we want to be in relationship with other white people, right? That have been doing this work for a long time. But we can't wait until we know everything before we move into action. And we actually think we're accountable, by being in action. And Dahlia, you should jump in whenever too, because you are deep in this too and have helped create these. So then there's two values that feel connected to me. So one is like growing is good and calling people in, which feel very, very connected to me. And I think this is about a couple of things, but it's about acknowledging that like we are all conditioned by white supremacy, right? And so a really intense thing can happen. Like when we see other white people make mistakes, for those of us who are white, we can get really, oftentimes, especially when we're newly politicized, we can just want to like point the finger and like call people out and point out how unlike them we are, right? And distance ourselves, which is really about our own discomfort with our whiteness, probably, if we really sit with it, than it is about, than it is about the other person. And so for us at SURJ, it means really actually moving towards people, right, who may not get it yet, and inviting them into our movement, and doing the work that it takes to move people from where they're at into where we know that we need them to be. And this piece about growing is good is that, you know, we talked about this earlier, but like, if we're going to like end white supremacy, and we're going to fundamentally transform this economic system that we live under that's so unjust, we're going to need a lot more people with us than we've got now, right? And we can't just have a tiny group of perfect white people. I'm saying that facetiously. We actually need power. And at SURJ, and many of our movement partners believe, like, power comes, we don't have a lot of money, right? But power can come from organized groups of people. And so we're trying to grow a base of people that can be in action, anti-racist action. And so we can't just be a tiny group of people, right? We're trying to grow intentionally over time to welcome more people in, so our movement has enough power to win things, because it's going to take a lot of power up against really, really powerful forces. Okay, those are 3 of them. So then there's two also that feel very connected, which is center class, and that there is enough for all. Feel deeply connected. Like at SURJ, we think it's really important that we understand that race was created in order to maintain an economic system that keeps a very, very small number of people wealthy at the expense of the many. And that racism is an incredibly powerful tool that they have to maintain that system. So we can't separate a conversation about white supremacy from capitalism, right? From the economic system that we're living under. And so that's really important in all of our political education work. You know, there's a movement elder I lean on a lot named Jerome Scott, and he constantly reminds us that white supremacy and racism was created to break our natural tendencies to unite. And I just think it's so powerful. It's just such a, it's just really, really powerful. And so I think when we talk about this, like, value of there being enough for all, there really is enough for all, right? There's people at the top that are trying to convince us that that is not true, and racism is their most powerful tool to do that. I think for us, there's also a strategic question, which maybe we can get into a little later, which is about, like, there's also a lot of poor white people in this country, right? Who are also not doing great under their current system. Like, before COVID hit, there were 65 million poor white people in this country, right? And mostly it's the right and the far right that are going after those folks and organizing white, poor and working class white folks. And so we think at SURJ, it's our responsibility. And they're doing it very well. And they're doing it very well. I mean, they're unabashed about it. They're like really going for it. Which is another historical piece. I mean, not to get too tangential, but I'm like, we want to learn the history of, our folks that chose the other America, chose the right side, but there's also a deep and long history of the right very intentionally organizing people to make sure that they don't unite, right, across lines of difference. That could be a whole other podcast. So then the two other values, one is take risk, make mistakes. We added make amends and keep going. Just that, like, it's inevitable for those of us, like, we're all humans, and especially as white people doing racial justice work, we know that we're going to make mistakes, right? And so when that happens, it's really important that despite what's coming up for us as, our feelings, that we actually, engage in receiving the feedback as a gift, right? And make amends with the person that we caused harm to, but that we stay in the work, right? There's just way too much at stake in this moment, and there's always been, for us to sit on the sidelines. And so we're not trying to be perfect. We're trying to be in the work in a process of constant, like, self-reflection and improvement. And then my favorite SURJ value is mutual interest, which is that we're not doing this as white people to help other people, right? That actually we have a stake in this fight, and that we want to really avoid coming in as white saviors or thinking that we know better, right? We can fall into that really, really easily. But we think it's critically important that we figure out what is our stake in this fight, and that we move from a place of shared interest, not from a place of trying to save anybody.
I love
Did I hit them all, Dahlia?
I think you did. I think you did. And, you know, and I just want to underscore like this came out of the work. This came out of learning. This came out of doing, learning, making those mistakes, coming back to the table, getting feedback and all of that to finally, you know, come to this place of understanding our values, understanding what the value is of organizing white people and all of that. And so, I'm glad that you ended your piece with mutual interest, because now I want to actually dig into that more. So, you know, there's this white savior thing that you talked about, like, you know, which is like this sort of this charity mentality, like, you know, as white people, we know what's better for all of these, you know, these types of people who are suffering, and that like we're going to just come in and we're going to fix it, right? And there's like a lot of media around that. There's a lot of movies that center, you know, the teacher that goes into this underfunded school and and like all of those kinds of things that constantly like get pushed into our faces of like, this is what you do to help people. And there's certainly lots of government programs that, you know, that cater to that, like the AmeriCorps and like all of those kinds of things. And so, but when we talk about mutual interests, we're talking about the fact that like white folks actually have something to gain by working in multiracial coalition for collective liberation. And so can you break down a little bit, like what's the material gains? Like how can we feel the types of ways that we would actually benefit from engaging in racial justice work?
Well, I think that white people have just about everything to gain from joining multiracial movements for justice. It's a mouthful. But there's also just like really concrete ways in which a lot of things would be very, as you said, Dahlia, materially different for white folks. Look, I think that racism is one of the most powerful tools that the right has used to undermine literally every social movement that's fighting on every front, on every issue we might care about. Forever. I think it'd be hard to find an example of a social movement that was not weakened by racism and white supremacy. It's a really, and they do that, right, by making sure that white folks feel more solidarity with white folks at the top, right, than other people we actually have a very shared common experience with. So I think about my own life, right? I think about the way in which the women's movement was undermined, right, by racism and white supremacy and has been weakened. The movement for queer liberation, movements for economic justice, right? Every single time white folks can get picked off, and it undermines in really material ways. We wouldn't be able to win way more things for everybody if white folks hadn't been used basically as a tool by those at the top to undermine those movements for justice. I mean, I also think there's a lot of like spiritual healing too. I mean, we talked some about like what white people have to give up and how that messes with our own sense of self too. I think that we have a lot to gain by undoing white supremacy on that level as well.
So circling back to the work of SURJ, more broadly, what do you hope will be gained through SURJ's efforts and movements for social, racial, and economic justice? And what are SURJ's unique contributions?
Yeah, good question. Similarly, I think that, so I think white communities are one of the biggest barriers to winning just about everything that we care about. I mean, I said this earlier, and I think if we really want to radically transform the world, we're going to need to not win over all the white people, but we do need more white folks than we have now to be moved into multiracial coalitions. And I think our unique contribution is like moving people into those fights at scale and in ways that are accountable to those folks on the front lines, right? I think, I talked about earlier, really like wanting to bring these two organizing traditions together, right? One that brings like a deep respect for history and deep political education and self-interrogation with the base building work, right? That's actually about transforming systems and structures. And so my hope at SURJ is that like we're moving, soon millions, we're moving hundreds of thousands of white folks now into accountable action. And my dream is that we'll be moving millions and millions of white people in communities that are really important to breaking the power of the right and to winning the really liberatory agenda that's been set by those most at the front, most impacted and really on the front lines of fights against racial capitalism and white supremacy. And, I think our unique contribution, I think there's a lot of really amazing groups that do deep political education, and oftentimes that's not matched with action. And I think one of the things I love about SURJ is that we're doing both, right? Imperfectly, but I think it's really important that we're trying to do both things at the same time. And I think another thing that's unique about SURJ is our that we're organizing so many different kinds of white people, and that we're also we have a new focus over the last couple of years on organizing in rural communities, in poor and working class communities, and in the rural South, which I think is different than some of the other anti-racist formations that have been out there that have been focused on organizing white folks. So,
cool. And so we're going to build a little bit off of that mention of the South. So you talked before about SURJ's values. We talked about how SURJ came about and so forth. And then this past year, dun, 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 SURJ released Guiding Stars, right? And then, there was a whole process. I know, I was part of some of that. I have some insider knowledge, but to the world that was not in those rooms, how did we land on these Guiding Stars, and why was there such a specific focus, both within the process of developing the Guiding Stars on the Southern region, and why has there been such a focus on the South?
So behind the curtain look here.
Yes, so the Wizard of Oz.
There was a lot. Wizard of Oz. So we landed at SURJ earlier this year on 2 Guiding Stars, and they are abolition and economic justice. And one of the reasons we landed on abolition for many reasons, but I think it was very, very important. So last summer, the summer of 2020, well, let me actually start by saying there's lots of people who have been doing abolitionist work inside the SURJ network for a really, really long time. So there were deep threads already kind of there. And as we've alluded to, I mean, you have to be living under a rock to not know that there were massive uprisings last summer, the summer of 2020, that moved literally millions of people into the streets for the first time ever and into action for racial justice for the first time ever. And lots of people were coming into SURJ, and lots of people were coming into movement and looking to SURJ as like, what do I do? I'm a white person and I want to show up in ways that are accountable. And I think it felt really important that and I think our movement did a really good job at making very clear what the problem was. And for the first time not the first time, but really abolitionist demands were becoming mainstream, which was really powerful. Organizations have been doing this work for a really, really long time. And people in power got really scared and waged an intentional campaign to make sure that did not continue. And it felt really important that as, a majority white national organization, that we were really clear about where we thought the solutions were. And we think that that's to defund the police and to make massive divestments out of the carceral state, and instead invest in frontline communities on their own terms. And so in the fight for what the solution is, it felt really important for us to be really clear in that moment that we were aligned with Black-led frontline organizations that were abolitionist, to both help new people coming into movement be really clear about that, and also to help our base, right, who are also people who are learning along the way, just to be really clear about kind of where we stood politically. So that felt really important in that moment, to be really absolutely clear about that. There's probably lots more to say about that. Dahlia, do you want to say anything else about the Abolition Star before?
No. I mean, we had to draw a damn line in the sand, at some point we had.
There's some wild ideas people got out there from people with a lot of power and a lot of money.
Right. And that was what was getting center stage attention after a while, was like, oh, when you're, it's like the concessions, right? Like, so we're demanding abolition, so then we have to concede by these like bullshit reforms, and we saw a lot of that kind of like coming out to water down this
can't wait bullshit.
8 can't wait, which we'll link to in the audience. We won't get into the 8 can't wait kind of stuff right now, unless we wanted to. But where it did become an issue for, when we look at, and Ivette can speak a lot to this around like, what are reforms that will help us achieve like abolition in the long run, and what are the reforms that will hurt us? And what we were seeing was that there were a lot of these reforms that were being pushed by mainstream politicians that would actually hurt us in the long run, and not actually achieve what our demands were.
Yeah, a lot of these reforms are not actually taking us towards abolition, because abolition is not necessarily just about immediate change. It can be incremental change so long as it's not conceding power or money or expanding the scope of what we're trying to dismantle, right? So, a lot of these reforms, like, we need more funding for training law enforcement. It's like, no, we need more funding for housing and for community-based care. So it's only expanding the amount of resources going towards law enforcement. So, one of the fundamental principles that we hold as JusticeLA and Dignity and Power Now is that we don't build anything that we have to dismantle in the future, right? And so it's really important to support incremental change that gets us to where we want to be, so long as it's not actually, one step forward, two steps back. And in the case of some of these reforms that were presented, like 8 Can't Wait, it wasn't a step forward. It was a million steps back.
Mm-hmm. And if we're a group of white folks who are trying to do the right thing and organizing in the right direction in social justice movements, then, I agreed with the assessment that it was time for us to get really clear on what our radical vision was that we were trying to achieve by these solidarity campaigns across the chapter network, by trying to mobilize, the base, and then also create means for people who weren't attached to a particular chapter or didn't have access to chapters to actually be able to still throw down in social justice movements, and then them knowing and having the language as to what they were trying to what the final end game was, which was abolition, and not mincing words, because there was enough of that going on. There was enough static happening around that.
Yeah, totally.
So there's another guiding star that we're gonna
go for it. Go for the other guiding star.
All right, I'll be so the second one's economic justice, and this is based on our assessment. I mean, some of the stuff we've been talking about right for the last bit of time here, which is that there are huge swaths of white communities who are suffering under racial capitalism, for whom there is very real pain happening for folks. And largely the Democratic Party and a lot of progressive infrastructure has not organized them. And instead the right has gone in to explain to people what is the cause of their suffering. And they're telling them communities of color, not the economic system and those at the top that are getting really, really wealthy off of our labor.
Sorry, I want to stop you right there, because you mentioned this term racial capitalism. And I'm sure some of our listeners are like, what is racial capitalism? We recognize racism and capitalism, right? But what does it mean to combine those two things?
It's such a good question. Racial capitalism is so jargony.
For folks who are looking to really dig in, and this is your jam is academia and some level, we'll throw some links to Robin D.G. Kelley, who is really amazing and can really break down racial capitalism. Not to say, Erin, that you can't, but for folks that really want to dive in ways that the next couple minutes may not be able to fully achieve. So all that to say, Erin, take it away. Racial capitalism.
Go listen to Robin is my first thing to say, because he's brilliant. Racial capitalism is a term so capitalism is the economic system that we live under, right? And we use the term racial capitalism to acknowledge the fact that the current system can't exist without race. There's no way for us to think about the economic system that we live under without understanding that race and racism and white supremacy is baked into it. So sometimes we think about, or we hear that there are disproportionate outcomes in our economy, right? People of color have, people talk a lot about the racial wealth gap, which is a very real thing. And sometimes when we only talk about the outcomes of racial capitalism on different communities, then we kind of lose the point that race is baked into the entire economic structure, and it's something that we actually have to contend with in our strategies for organizing. I'm not sure how great that was at a description at a 101.
No, that's great.
But we can't just think about the outcomes. We have to think about how race is used to maintain the system. Because when we understand that, then we're able to design organizing interventions that can actually help more white people build solidarity with communities of color, which actually is going to be the thing that I think is the most transformative move for our movement. So
no, that's super helpful. And, just for some context, every single capitalist system has depended upon subjugation of a specific group of people in order to extract labor. There is no exception, right? And so when you're talking about, race being a component that's baked into our capitalist system, it's really part of the rationale for subjugating and extracting from marginalized communities in order to build capital, right? Like those are the fundamental building blocks of an extractive economic system known as capitalism.
yes.
Fucking A. Okay. So,
Love it.
I hope everybody's really enjoying this conversation as much as I am. And we're just going to round out right before we end just a little bit more conversation about the South. Like, why, because in the earlier days of my involvement in SURJ back in 2014, there wasn't the strategic decision to focus on the South as much. Like it wasn't like something that I recall hearing, and it was definitely part of the evolution of organizing and being in movement and hearing feedback and so forth, and then really making a strategic choice of where resources were going to go, and that was in the South. And so, can you talk a little bit more about the why behind that, the outcomes of that so far, and any sort of success stories or anything that you wanted to share? Especially because a lot of people, I think, and myself, like, growing up in Massachusetts, growing up in New England, we have this idea of what we think constitutes the South. And it's just not that, right? Like, it's pretty radical. And there's a huge, tradition of resistance. And so, can you talk a little bit about why SURJ chose to throw down both within the guiding stars and the evolution of that over time?
Well, I'll pick up where you left off, which is just that, like, there is deep movement in the South and a deep organizing tradition. I got to interview Angela Davis once, and she was like, all the most badass white anti-racists come out of the South, right? And it's because, and so I'm like, take that with a lot of respect. There's just a deep, deep history of resilience and organizing under really repressive conditions that a lot of us who have not organized in the region, like, don't know and don't understand. And it's, folks are brilliant. So the long lineage there, I just want to start there. Look, I think the right in this country from the founding of the country has known that their ability to control the country comes from their ability to control the South, and more specifically from in their capacity to make sure that poor and working class white people do not build multiracial solidarity with other working class communities of color. So just on a very pragmatic level, the South, like, if we cannot defeat the Republican Party and far right forces in the South, we don't think we're going to be able to beat them nationally. The Du Bois quote, "As goes the South, so goes the nation." Like, we share that assessment. And so while SURJ organizes nationally, we think it's a really strategic role for really important place to be organizing white people. So one, like, there's just an incredible amount of power that's controlled there. So I think it's like, in order to win the presidency, I think 40% of the electoral college votes come from the South. And some of the most far right actors right now in the government, this has been true forever, but it's like even more explicit now, come out of the South, right? And so at the congressional level. So when we think about control of the federal government, we actually have to be breaking up their power in the South long haul in order to be able to shift things at the national level. It's clearly not the only move needed, right? But we think it's a really, really important one. And when we think about our lane at SURJ, our role is organizing white folks, right? And there's the highest concentration of poor white folks are in the South. These are the folks who are most suffering economically under racial capitalism. white folks. And so when we think about where are the numbers of people who have the most to gain from joining a movement for justice, there are millions and millions of poor white people in the South that we know that are going to come with us, right? If we go out and organize, if we knock their doors, if we create the political homes for people to join. Because we know that the right is door knocking. The right has developed this very sophisticated communications infrastructure and has targeted rural Southern communities. And so as we begin to chip away in those communities and create different alternative homes and help people understand a different way to make meaning of what's happening to them in different ways, we're actually undercutting the power of the right. And this is really, really long haul work, but we think it's really important if we're going to be able to really defeat the far right in this country and create more space, for a liberatory vision to flourish and to be won by our comrades and partners. So if we have time, I could tell a quick story.
Yes, we'd love to hear
some
stories,
cool.
success stories, examples. Yeah, give it.
Yeah. So one of our dear comrades in rural Tennessee started organizing. So the Klan in 2017, after Charlottesville happened, there was a white power rally that was planned in a town in rural Tennessee. And some folks who had been connected to the SURJ network loosely decided to plan a counter rally. So there was a visible presence that was, that was anti-Klan. And then they began knocking on people's doors, right? Talking to people, because the Klan had been doing that. They've been doing lit drops and trying to, recruit people to join them. And so we were like, we're going to do that too. So we started knocking doors and talking to people, both about what they thought about the presence of the Klan in their community, but also about the issues that were impacting their lives. And we asked people where were their pain points? What was the issues that were impacting their lives? And we found, after talking to like 500 folks in a very small town, so this is a good chunk of folks in the town, that 94% of people there didn't have safe or affordable housing. That people had all kinds of issues with the landlords, and there was a very small number of landlords that were controlling the town. And, we began to bring people together to make sense of this and to help better understand that the source of their problems were not their immigrant neighbors, right? Or communities of color there, but it was the landlords, and it was the city council, and it was the state government that wouldn't let them pass, affordable housing ordinances because they were being blocked at the state level. And we start connecting people with communities of color in cities that were also fighting for affordable housing. And we've won some really powerful shit. Like throughout COVID, we've been able to keep lots of people in their houses and preventing them from getting evicted. We've been fighting, alongside comrades at the national level for more renter protections throughout COVID. And one of our members got elected to city council on an anti-Klan, pro-renter agenda in a town that Trump won by 70%. So it is deeply possible in very conservative parts of the country to move people if we speak to their suffering. And if we do this work with people that is not hiding from race, not talking about it and hoping that people won't talk about it, but talking about it explicitly to help people understand that they have much more to gain by multiracial solidarity than they do, building around a solidarity of whiteness. So, that's one story, but there's many more of really powerful work that's happening across the rural South.
Super powerful, really, really inspirational. I'm glad that we're lifting the veil from this notion that the South is not a nexus of organizing and is not at the forefront, because that's just not historically true, and it's not true on the ground. And I think that narrative, that false narrative, is really something that that impacts the way that we build national power, right? And that we're able to actually build with our comrades in the South. It's a really harmful narrative. Like, I'm so glad that you named what we need to do to win, and that we need the South and we need to be in solidarity, and really learning from the wins and the really sharp organizing that's happening down there. there's so many great organizations that are based in the South, like queer organizations, like really radical queer organizations that are doing amazing work. So I'm glad we lifted that up.
Yeah, they're so incredibly. I mean, not to name the obvious, but I'm like, look at what happened in Georgia. People counted them out for years, and it was largely Black women like doing the nuts, the day in, day out, not very glamorous organizing work. That's, registering people to vote and then getting people out, and folks counted them out, and look what happened. Flipped the entire federal government. Which is not a small thing. Insufficient, but a really, really important piece of the puzzle.
So this is the part of our podcast where we do a call to action. So if there's anything for our audience to read, listen, watch, or donate to, can you please share?
Yeah. The first thing I want you to do is, for those of you who are white, I want you all to join SURJ. So if you go to surj.org, you can sign up to become a member, and we will put you to work and help you do some of that learning and unlearning. What I'm reading, I got 2 recs these days. One is The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. It's a really good read on mutual interest. This term that we talked about, helping, understand how we all have something to gain. And then we talked about Anne Braden. So I got to give the Anne Braden biography, Subversive Southerner, if you haven't done that shout out on the podcast yet. It's really, really powerful book about some of the lineage and history we can be proud of and want to grow into.
Oh, yeah. Any organization you would suggest donating to?
Oh, let's lift up our comrades at the New Georgia Project. We were just talking about the South and the really, strategic importance of the South. The New Georgia Project did a lot of the work that got us over the line in Georgia. Folks can always donate to the Highlander Center, who I've mentioned several times throughout this call. They've been, a movement home for so much of that radical work in the South. So, yeah.
Awesome. And of course, folks can donate to SURJ as well. So we'll shout out a donation to SURJ in addition to comrades.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's been super fun, Erin.
Thanks for having me, y'all.
I'm so excited we just got to have that conversation with Erin. That was a gem.
Thanks for listening, y'all. Find the links to what we talked about today in the show notes, which can be found at patreon.com/smallbeans. The show is hosted and produced by me, Ivette Ale.
And me, Dahlia Ferlito.
Produced by Hannah Jers Allen of White People for Black Lives, and produced and edited by Michael Swaim and Abe Epperson of Small Beans Comedy. Theme song by Rachael Cantu.
That's a wrap, y'all.